Hi students, welcome back. We are now in our 12th week and we are talking about moral injury. And just as a reminder, this is the last of our interlude before we continue to discuss other subjects. So in particular, I want to offer a debrief from last week since I was gone and your TA capably handled the segment on military chaplaincy, and prior to that we had the intensive. What I'll do is I'll show a short video from Rita Nakashima Brock. This is not the longer one that I assigned for 4-unit students, but just to introduce the topic of moral injury. I'll say something about the book, and then of course about the various authors. You'll see that I've assigned very, very short reading excerpts. They're 2 to 5 pages max. But what I've done is I've just kind of pulled out interesting passages and some points that I want you to consider from the readings. And then finally, I want to say something about where we are in the class, since things are wrapping up quickly and you have more behind you than you had ahead of you, although there is a final project that you need to be working toward. So now just a point about the debrief. As I mentioned, it was such a delight for me to interact with you and for me to see you all interact with one another. I really felt like we came together as a class. I was very, very happy to see that the concepts that you had already studied, you had deepened your knowledge and understanding of them. And again, we were able to come together as a class. So well done there. And now we turn to military chaplaincy. And I see that a number of you are coming from, the international students are coming from a very different perspective because the chaplaincy might be set up differently there. And in the US, because of the readings that your TA assigned, you see that it's a little bit of an odd duck. On the one hand, these are government paid workers, and yet they have ecclesiastical endorsements, and yet they have to provide for the religious needs of everyone in the military, not just their own particular denomination. So well done on combing through that and trying to get an understanding of what it is that chaplains do. As I mentioned before, some of the readings that I've assigned this week are actually from chaplains, and you will see that they themselves are capable of being morally injured. Okay, so now I want to turn to a video segment where Rita Nakashima Brock, this is the person you've listened to before on her work on atonement, and she is a leading expert on moral injury, and she is going to be discussing what it is and how it is and it is not different from, let's say, PTSD. So enjoy this video.
So this is a short working definition for moral injury. It comes in the wake of high-stakes situations in which things go very wrong and harm results. So the first place this was studied was, of course, in war with veterans of war, but there are many other places where moral injury can occur. Anyone who has a moral conscience is susceptible to it. It can emerge in those who do the wrong, those who are harmed by those they trust, who have power or authority. So it can be something that is done wrong to you, not just something wrong that you might have done. It can affect those who are witnesses to that harm. This is what you might call bystander effect. And it can affect those who have an emotional investment in an event and hear about the harm. So it can come from many different ways. I actually know people who never actually had to do something, but just even getting ready and imagining having to do something pretty devastating has affected them deeply. So it's serious, and it disrupts our love and meaning systems. So As human beings, love is crucial to survival and to being a decent person and having a sense of our own humanity. So to have that disrupted is a major break. What are some of the signs of moral injury? So some of the social issues you may notice if someone has it is that they may be isolating, not wanting to socialize or be with other people. They may have a lot of aggression, even a toxic kind of anger that they're not able to control, or they may be misusing substances to control the pain. Or they may feel unsafe all the time. They may just anxious and even hypervigilant sometimes. They lack trust. They mistrust themselves and other people. They will often be suspicious of others' motives or behaviors. And they're not able really to engage in intimate relationships because their capacity to trust is so impaired, and you have to have that to have good relationships. The spiritual challenges of moral injury include loss of faith. You can imagine how it might feel if you're in a really terrible situation and you really believe that your faith is powerful and that if you pray, the worst thing won't happen, and then the worst thing happens. And a loss of faith may be that you stop believing in God at all, or it may be that you're just so angry at God you don't want to have a relationship with your previous tradition. You may also give up on ordinary relationships. We all know that something devastating that it happens within a relationship, even if it's not something that the two people did to each other, if it's an external event like the loss of a child or something like that, it can really disrupt a relationship if it's not healed. And moral injury shows up often in high divorce rates in people who experience it, or them just not connecting anymore to people they previously related to. It can also mean people lose that kind of personal discipline and structure that they have in their lives, that they don't like authority, don't like structures, resentful of it, or themselves just give up all the personal disciplines they used to have. Existential issues include fatalism, despair, and another sign of it is important is unrelenting grief, sorrow that just doesn't have comfort in it at all. And the self becomes a negative thing. People will sometimes say, I became evil, or I have an evil thing inside me. They may loathe themselves, really hate themselves, or say things like, I don't know who I am anymore, but who I was just isn't here. And they may get so severe in their moral injury that they contemplate taking their lives because they just don't feel like they deserve to live anymore. Next slide, please. So there's some main points about moral injury I think it's important to remember. And the first one is one that is a little bit surprising for me to have come to, not because I don't believe it, but because generally psychologists, psychiatrists, and social scientists tend to avoid making existential or essentialist claims about human beings, about human nature. That's sort of the job of theologians. And as a theologian, I sort of do that sometimes, but I've been surprised in my work with so many psychiatrists and psychologists that their work in moral injury is leading them to conclude that we are all born moral because it's essential to being loved, and we don't survive without love from the moment we're born. And I actually agree with them. I do believe that human beings are born moral, which is why moral injury is such a serious personal crisis and a collective crisis. It's not just something that can happen to one individual. It can happen to whole groups of people. So it's really important to remember we are born moral. And moral injury, therefore, is also not a disorder. It's a risk of the human condition and human frailty, but it results in a sort of war inside that is anguishing. And it comes from that moral place in us, our humanity, that is now fighting with our experiences that devastated us. It's we call it the war inside, because the experiences that cause moral injury, that have led to the moral injury, can't be integrated. They just sort of take over and haunt people, and they just are sitting there, and the conscience can't make sense of it, can't integrate it into a moral meaning system that makes sense of life. So alleviating that suffering, alleviating the moral anguish of moral injury, requires us to actually reconstruct our humanity. And part of that is that because the moral injury trauma has taken over a sense of self, it tends to blot out a narrative of life that can remember any goodness before it happened. So part of the task of alleviating the suffering is helping people reconstruct a life narrative where the moral injury isn't the only defining thing about that life. And that's the process that begins a way to create a sense of meaning and purpose that will make sense of our lives. So reconstructing our humanity is how we recover from moral injury. But that reconstruction can't ignore the moral injury. It can't just say, okay, well, that's in the past now and we can move on. You don't really move on from it. It's never going to be forgotten. It may still cause pain in your life every time you think about it. But instead of being the biggest factor in your life that defines who you are, it becomes a piece of information for understanding who we are and developing a greater sense of wisdom and integrity from having reflected upon it in a deep way. And that kind of reflection takes a very long time. It's not a simple process. It isn't, well, okay, now I'm going to sit down and write about it and think about it, and it will be over.
Okay, so before we turn to other things, I did want to show you this graph comparing PTSD with moral injury. So they are not the same thing. In some cases, there may be similar presentations or similar symptoms, but treating PTSD is not the same thing as treating moral injury. Ultimately, PTSD is a mental disorder that requires a diagnosis. And what the experts say is that moral injury is a dimensional problem. There's no threshold for the presence of it, but rather at a given point in time, a veteran, or we're talking about the military, but a veteran may have a none to mild to extreme manifestations. So know that there can be an area of overlap, but it is a different thing, right? They are not the same thing. Okay, so now moving on to this book. This is a fantastic book. I didn't assign much of the first portion where we have some writings from poets and some writings from journalists. I mostly focused on writings from veterans, chaplains, and other staffers in the military who have some expertise in this area, or sorry, not just the military, but psychologists like Jonathan Shea, who is credited for coining the term. But this is a reader co-edited by Robert Emmett Meager and Douglas A. Pryor, and really excited about this week of readings and discussion that we're about to have. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to discuss the authors or the readings that I've assigned for you in two batches. And so first we have Edward Tick, who is a transformational psychotherapist, an educator, and an author of 6 books. He is the director of Soldier's Heart, and that is a film you can watch if interested. And next we have Hamilton Gregory. He was a U.S. Army intel agent in the late 1960s. and he's the one who authored McNamara's Folly, the use of low IQ men in the Vietnam War by 2015. And again, you've read an excerpt of that in this book. Next, we have Bill Edmonds. He's a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He is the author of God Is Not Here, A Soldier's Struggle with Torture, Trauma, and the Moral Injuries of War. And he has a 20-year career in the military. Next, we have Timothy Kudo, who was deployed as a captain in the Marines to Iraq and Afghanistan in 29 to 11. And now he's a consultant at McKinsey. And finally, we have Charles Pacello. You recall he was the former Air Force officer, now serving as a life coach and healing expert for PTSD, depression, and trauma. So again, I'm going to go one by one through this first batch, and then we'll discuss the second. Okay, so let's start first with Edward Tick. This is a reflection where he opens with a story of Ben, and Ben is someone who experienced his military comrades taking pleasure in killing 3 unarmed and confused VC. Ultimately, Tick concludes that unfortunately we make wars in ways that harm our warriors. And in a passage I've reproduced here, he talks about, our warriors are following orders, and yet they find these actions shameful or wrong. And when other people don't take responsibility for them, they themselves do. And that leads to lifelong crippling consequences, namely moral injury. He also references the work of psychologist Jonathan Shea, and Shea is the person who's credited with introducing moral injury into our thinking. He had defined it as a betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation by someone who holds power. Tick says something profound, and I think it's true, which is that, look, killing another human being under, most circumstances, it's just got to be one of the most traumatic things you can experience. And so somehow you're going to be impacted by it. There's no other way. Even if you use the language of justified killing, you're still going to be a person, unless you're a psychopath, right, who has to wrestle with the thing you've done. And he also mentions how moral injury can affect people even if they themselves haven't done the wrong. So to reference the work of another psychologist, Brett Litz, who defines moral injury as occurring when you see perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and experiences. And in this box on the right, I list out some phenomena and symptoms and about for those who suffer from moral injury. Okay, so that is Tick's short piece. Turning now to Hamilton Gregory's. Remember, he is the one who wrote the book about McNamara's Folly, and this was tied to the fact that they had a personnel shortage during the Vietnam War, and so they had to draft people. And in the Vietnam War, a lot of middle class and children of Congress folks had ways to get out of the draft. But certainly working class people had fewer of those ways, and especially so if those with lower IQ did. And this is a piece where he's talking about they purposely lowered the threshold, the IQ threshold, so those who had, serious cognitive impairments were still drafted. And we know from statistics that folks with low IQ were 3 times more likely to die. So in this chapter, Gregory talks about himself being outraged by this, documenting this, hearing the stories of people who themselves were sent out to die, and then their friends and family feeling like they didn't even stand a chance. They couldn't understand the basic concept of firing a rifle or hitting the target, in a certain amount of time. And so again, this is Hamilton Gregory's reflection on how he and many others who witnessed the utter unfairness about the draft and the total loss of life, not just by war, but conscripting people who just barely had a chance, right? And how they were morally injured by what they saw and experienced. Okay, turning now to our next thinker. This is Bill Edmonds, and he has written a short piece called God is Not Here. In a key part of this piece, he talks about someone who had confessed to committing 10 executions, but that he was in prison beforehand and was actually released back into Mosul streets. And then he went out to commit 10 more executions. His larger reflection is in the context of the Iraqi war, when they worked out that they were fighting an insurgency. And so in order for the U.S. to not be in Iraq forever and ever, they had to train Iraqis. And his reflection is mostly about how the Iraqis they were training really had difficulty grasping the concept that they should not torture to extract interrogations. They felt that way because, look, we had bad guys in our midst who themselves had done terrible things, and why can't we do that? And so he had to use all sorts of appeals to tell them you shouldn't torture, including the fact that you might be creating more terrorists, especially if you end up interrogating people who are not guilty of the crimes you suspect them. Interestingly enough, this leads him to a reflection on, well, what is torture? Again, if you're not familiar with this era, you might recall that under the Bush administration, the U.S. started to use phrases like enhanced interrogation. They didn't want to use the word torture because if you use the word torture, and if the U.S., like most other countries, are parties to the Convention Against Torture, then they would be openly admitting flouting international law. So this is what the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment says torture is. You can read that definition on the screen grab. You can pause this recording and read that. And so something that I'll ask on Teams and something I want you to think about is, in light of Bill Edmonds' questions about what exactly torture is, consider what the international definition is and come to a judgment on his various questions. Okay, the next thinker is Timothy Kudo, and he's written a piece called War and Redemption. And what I really like about this idea is that this piece is that he's really emphasizing the point about collective responsibility, right? He talks about what lingers is not so much the carnage of, although of course that's awful, but it's the morality, right? He says we did evil things, maybe necessary evil, but it's evil nonetheless. He talks about how the things that he saw actually became commonplace during war, but of course that doesn't make it right. He especially focuses on the fact that, look, he didn't pull the trigger, but he ordered people to do. And when you're an officer, there's little difference because at the end of the day, in militaries, groups kill. Of course, individuals pull the trigger or not, but groups kill. And so there absolutely must be a sense of moral responsibility. And then, of course, there's a disconnect between what they experience on the field and what their commanders keep talking about in terms of the pain and the glory and the sacrifice for noble ideas like democracy and freedom, or even patriotic ideas like you did it for your country. Okay, the last thinker that I'll discuss in this group is Charles Pacello's, and I thought this was super, super poignant. Again, he's got this, he was an Air Force officer. He says he has a Catholic Italian family roots. And basically, he was training to be able to deliver first strike capability with nuclear weapons. Again, you can read this passage in full here and in the reading selection. But basically, when he worked out what actually had he been trained to do, all of the technical knowledge, all of that, he realized, oh my goodness, I have been training to annihilate the entirety of humankind. Again, because he was in charge of doing the various things to ensure first strike capability, basically an all-out nuclear war. And when he finally realized the gravity of what he was doing, what all of his training had been leading up to, he felt like he experienced an instance of moral injury, this deep, deep, deep wounding. And so he goes on to talk about, well, what is moral injury? It's a crisis within the soul, the seat of our conscience, wounding our hearts and severing our bodies with others, with the divine. Ultimately, he talks about the spiral, the broken relationships, et cetera, that he experienced. And what's really interesting to me, and hopefully to you, is that he uses religious imagery to discuss this. And so I'm going to ask you on Teams what you made of his religious imagery. Okay, so now we turn to our next batch of authors. And we will start first with David Peters. He has written this really intriguing piece called Sin Eater. He is a Marine and Army chaplain, former, of course. He's been doing some writing, and he was in the past the vicar at Episcopal Diocese of Texas. And then we have William Mahedy. He was a chaplain in Vietnam. He co-founded a series of organizations helping veterans, and also has taken some clerical vows, which you can read by yourself. Now, really interestingly, as you know, Catholic priests are not supposed to be married, and so he went from being a Catholic priest to an Episcopalian priest when he wanted to get married. Next, we have Eric Newhouse, who's a retired newspaper editor, and he actually won a Pulitzer Prize talking about the faces of combat, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD. And then finally, we have Pete Kilner, who I've assigned because he's talking specifically about the leadership training and the type of training soldiers should receive in order to lessen their risk of moral injury. So we'll conclude with these four thinkers. Okay, let's first talk about David Peters and his concept of sin eating. Again, because he's taking clerical vows, you see that he talks about Psalm 91 and how soldiers use it superstitiously, almost like an amulet. You can look up Psalm 91 on your own. And he has this interesting concept of a sin eater, someone who eats the food for the dead, thus allowing their souls to pass on. And he analogizes it to people like chaplains and others who basically hear the confessions of military who've done and seen terrible, horrible, awful things. He basically talks about what chaplains do and how serving in Iraq as a chaplain was a high point of his life. It redefined everything. And yet, even though he was a chaplain, even though he was not in combat, he ended up being morally injured because of, he was ashamed about how much enthusiasm he had for the war. He had to bear everyone's confessions. I also thought he wrote this interesting passage about medics and how medics have this job of picking up the remains, like the grisly remains of fallen soldiers who have, bits and pieces of boots and helmets or whatever. and how they are able to bear this. It is a true service they can offer to everyone, because surely not everyone can bear this. In the next series of passages, he is talking about his sense of God and how it has radically changed through his experiences in warfare. And I'd be curious about what you make of his understanding of how God has changed. So he used to think God was one way, and now he thinks God cares about nothing but each and every human being. Again, I'd be curious to hear what you make of that. Okay, let's turn now to chapter 33, Willem Mahedy, excerpts from a chaplain's notebook. He's saying a number of things here. He talks about how in combat, folks have to embrace evil, and evil also embraces them. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that these 12 steps resemble Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps, which for our international students, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's a very well-known alcohol recovery program. But take a look at his 12 steps to spiritual recovery. And then finally, we have Eric Newhouse. Sorry, not finally. We have one more after Eric. He's talking about recovery from moral injury. He references Edward Tick, which is really good. Again, to show previous thinkers. And he's talking about the importance of social rituals and what it means to counsel people when they themselves hold the burden and guilty conscience of being the perpetrator, not the victim. So what does it mean to counsel and lead folks through their moral injuries? He offers a series of concrete solutions. He talks about the importance of atonement, the importance of forgiveness, and exercise. And he talks about the importance of experiencing the adrenaline rush of, very exciting sports or things like whitewater rafting, but the adrenaline without the fear of war, if you can, make that switch. So that is Newhouse's piece. And then finally, we turn to Peter Kilner. And what I like about this is he tries to say, look, in the way we train soldiers for combat, we tell them what the laws of war are. We tell them what they will and won't get in trouble for, right? So we talk about international law and we talk about professional standards, but he says they don't really engage the moral questions. They kind of bracket it. But that it's actually very, very important that they face head on those moral questions. And that involves not dehumanizing the enemy. That involves making sure that military service personnel, they have outlets to let off steam, but not in destructive ways, right? So the stereotype is that, they go into brothels and they end up doing the equivalent of, they end up having, there's a lot of drug use, there's a lot of hiring of sex workers, and in some cases, not just hiring consensually sex workers, but raping them, right? So what does it mean to train people to figure out ways to release their energies in healthy ways? Okay, students, for this week, that's it. It's a lot, but I hope you find the readings both really compelling, very thought-provoking, knowing that, of course, we focused on the damage of war. We've talked about moral justifications for or against war, but now we're talking about the experience of those who are directly involved in fighting the war or who are witnesses to it as chaplains, and the various ways they can be morally injured. Just to note that we're near the end. This is the time you need to be thinking about your final projects. Please take note of how I said we would do the midterm number 2 points. So you have your choice of just receiving your midterm 1 scores doubled or, calibrated for midterm 2, or you have a chance of rewriting your midterm 2 or just those portions that you got wrong for higher points. And then for midterm 2, I would give you that. Reach out if you have any questions. Looking forward to what you see on Teams this week. Okay, bye-bye.